For almost all of our existence, there were no ceilings above us, no walls to seal out the wind, no glass between our eyes and the horizon. The ground was our floor, the sky our constant companion, and the rhythm of light and darkness shaped every thought, every movement, every generation. Yet today, we spend nearly all our lives inside enclosed spaces, as if that were normal. If the human story is 300,000 years long, and cities are only a brief closing chapter, what did it truly mean that 80% of human history was spent outside? And what quiet part of us still belongs there? Why 80% of human history was spent outside? If the entire existence of our species were compressed into a single year, almost every month would pass without a single permanent wall. For hundreds of thousands of years after the first Homo sapiens appeared in Africa, there were no cities, no streets, no rooms, and no roofs that lasted beyond a season. The number itself is simple but difficult to feel. Roughly 300,000 years of human presence, and only in the last 10,000 did agriculture begin to anchor people to one place. In that long stretch before farming, before villages, before stone foundations, daily life unfolded under open sky. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must first slow down and look at the scale of time itself, because without that scale, the modern world feels larger than it truly is. Fossil evidence and genetic studies place the emergence of anatomically modern humans in Africa around 300,000 years ago, with early remains discovered at sites such as Jebel Irhoud in present-day Morocco. For nearly all of that time, humans lived as hunter-gatherers, moving across landscapes shaped by climate shifts, grasslands, rivers, and coastlines. Agriculture, which began independently in several regions around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, represents only a thin slice at the very end of this timeline. If we divide 300,000 years into 10 equal parts, the final part would contain all known cities, written language, empires, and industrial societies. The previous 9 parts would contain people without permanent buildings, sleeping in temporary shelters, caves, or open camps. When we say that 80% of human history was spent outside, we are not speaking metaphorically. We are describing a numerical reality grounded in archaeology and evolutionary biology. For most generations that have ever existed, the horizon was visible every day. The sky changed color above them without interruption from glass or concrete. Their children were born into environments where wind, light, and temperature were not filtered. Even when natural shelters such as caves were used, these were not enclosed houses in the modern sense. They were partial protections within a much larger open environment. The deep past of our species unfolded during the Pleistocene epoch, a period marked by repeated ice ages and shifting climates. Human groups adapted by moving, not by constructing heavy permanent structures. Mobility was more reliable than architecture. Materials available: wood, animal hides, plant fibers decomposed quickly and rarely survived in the archaeological record, which is why we find stone tools far more often than dwellings. The scarcity of preserved houses from this immense period is not an accident. It reflects a way of life where built environments were light, temporary, and secondary to the landscape itself. When we look at the timeline from the perspective of evolutionary change, 10,000 years is too brief to reshape the human body in fundamental ways. Natural selection operates across far longer spans. This means that the physiology we carry today, our skin, our eyes, our circadian rhythms, was formed during those long outdoor millennia. The open air was not a backdrop. It was the constant condition in which human traits stabilized. Each time we return to the beginning of our species, we return to a world without ceilings. That is the baseline against which all later developments must be measured. Cities feel permanent because they surround us, but in evolutionary time they are recent experiments. The majority of human ancestors never knew them. When we quietly calculate the proportions, the numbers do not accuse or romanticize. They simply reveal that the outdoor world was the dominant setting of human existence for most of our history, and only very recently did walls begin to define our days. When we imagine the distant past, it is easy to compress it into a vague and distant blur. Yet the early chapters of human existence were not brief or primitive interludes. They lasted longer than everything that came after them combined. If we stand again at the origin of Homo sapiens in Africa around 300,000 years ago and move forward slowly, we notice that for most of that journey there were no settled villages, no agriculture, and no architecture designed to endure across generations. The timeline stretches quietly, almost without visible interruption, across tens of thousands of years in which people lived within landscapes rather than inside constructed environments. To grasp why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must resist the instinct to give disproportionate weight to recent centuries simply because they are familiar to us. Written history, which often feels vast, covers only about 5,000 years. Large urban centres with dense populations and complex infrastructure are even more recent in most parts of the world. Industrialized indoor life, characterized by sealed buildings, artificial lighting, and climate control, occupies barely 2 centuries. In contrast, the period in which humans relied entirely on hunting, gathering, fishing, and foraging spans roughly 290,000 years. That is not a symbolic comparison. It is a measurable contrast between 2 different ways of inhabiting the planet. Archaeological evidence from sites across Africa, the Levant, Europe, Asia, and Australia shows patterns of seasonal movement, repeated campsite use, and small social groups. Hearths, stone tools, and animal bones appear in layers of sediment, marking temporary occupations rather than permanent residence. Even when certain locations were revisited for generations, the structures themselves were light and adaptable. The environment remained dominant. Climate during the Pleistocene shifted repeatedly between colder and warmer phases. Glaciers expanded and retreated. Sea levels rose and fell. In such a world, heavy, permanent architecture would have been less practical than flexibility. Mobility allowed human groups to follow migrating animals, seasonal plants, and changing water sources. The outside was not an exposure to be minimized. It was the medium in which life was organized. If we divide the 300,000-year history of our species into 20 equal segments of 15,000 years each, agriculture would occupy less than 1 segment. Cities would fit into a fraction of that. Everything before that final narrow portion would consist of people waking under open skies. This mathematical framing is not meant to diminish later achievements. It simply corrects our sense of proportion. From an evolutionary perspective, the dominant environmental condition shaping our species was open air, shifting weather, natural light cycles, and broad landscapes. Each generation learned skills appropriate to that context. Children grew up observing the horizon, tracking animal movement, reading clouds, and responding directly to seasonal change. When we return, again and again, to the origin point of our species, we encounter humans whose daily survival depended on intimate awareness of outdoor surroundings. There were no thick barriers separating interior from exterior, because there was no permanent interior to retreat into. The distinction itself did not carry the same meaning. It is only in the closing fraction of our timeline that indoor space becomes the default. Measured calmly against the depth of human time, living outside was not an exception. It was the rule, sustained across thousands of generations before the first enduring walls appeared. If we continue to widen the frame, the proportion becomes even clearer. Around 300,000 years ago, early Homo sapiens were already shaping stone tools in Africa, already walking across open grasslands, already organizing life around water sources and migrating animals. For the next 200,000 years, nothing resembling a permanent town existed. Human groups expanded gradually into the Middle East, Asia, Australia, and eventually Europe, always carrying with them a way of living that required movement through open terrain. Even after humans reached every major continent except Antarctica, the pattern remained the same. Small populations, low density, and constant engagement with outdoor environments. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, it is not enough to count years. We must also consider how many generations those years represent. If we estimate an average of 25 years per generation, then 300,000 years contain roughly 12,000 generations of humans. Of those, more than 11,000 lived entirely before agriculture. That means that for over 11,000 successive generations, children were born into a world without permanent houses in the modern sense. Their first sights were not ceilings but sky. Their first sounds were wind, insects, distant animals, and human voices carrying across open air. The repetition across generations matters because evolution acts through repetition. Traits that fit the environment persist because they support survival and reproduction. During those thousands of generations, the relevant environment was overwhelmingly outdoor. Even when natural shelters were used, they were extensions of landscape rather than insulated spaces disconnected from it. Archaeological findings from Upper Paleolithic Europe show temporary huts built from mammoth bones and animal hides. But these structures were seasonal and responsive to climate. They did not form dense, walled neighborhoods separated from the surrounding ecosystem. Similarly, rock shelters and caves provided protection from weather, yet they opened directly onto broader terrain. The boundary between inside and outside remained thin and permeable. Population size also reinforces the scale. For most of prehistory, the total number of humans on Earth was small, often estimated in the millions or less. Such low density meant vast expanses of land relative to each group. There were no crowded urban centers forcing people into compact, enclosed quarters. Space was abundant, and survival required knowledge of that space. When agriculture began roughly 10,000 years ago, in regions such as the Fertile Crescent, China, Mesoamerica, and parts of Africa, it marked a turning point in how humans related to land. Yet even then, early farming villages were modest and often semi-open. It took thousands more years before dense cities with complex architecture became common. In terms of generational experience, the shift toward predominantly indoor living is extraordinarily recent. Only in the last few hundred years, and especially in the last century, have large portions of humanity begun spending most waking and sleeping hours within enclosed structures. Compared to the 11,000 generations before farming, the number of generations shaped by sealed indoor life is very small. Each time we return to the beginning of our species and trace forward carefully, the same pattern appears. The outdoor world was not an occasional setting. It was the continuous stage upon which nearly all human lives unfolded. Measured across generations rather than centuries, the weight of that reality becomes steady and difficult to ignore. When the first Homo sapiens emerged in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago, they did not step into a world organized by walls. They entered landscapes shaped by grasslands, scattered trees, rivers that swelled and receded with seasonal rains, and long horizons that could be scanned for movement. The African environments of the Middle and Late Pleistocene were not uniform deserts or endless forests, but mosaics of savanna, woodland, and open plains. Fossil evidence, pollen records, and sediment layers indicate fluctuating climates, with alternating wetter and drier phases. Human survival in such settings required direct exposure to these shifts rather than insulation from them. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must begin here, in the ecological context that formed the earliest chapters of our species. The savanna environment offered both opportunity and risk. Large herbivores grazed across open ground, creating predictable patterns of movement that could be observed from a distance. Predators also moved across the same terrain. Visibility mattered. The ability to detect motion on the horizon, to interpret animal tracks, and to anticipate weather changes became essential skills. These skills were learned not inside constructed rooms but in continuous contact with open surroundings. Archaeological sites across East and Southern Africa reveal stone tools associated with animal processing, suggesting coordinated group activity in outdoor spaces. Hearth remains indicate the controlled use of fire, but these fires were typically situated in open camps rather than enclosed structures. Fire extended activity into the evening and provided protection, yet it did not transform the environment into a sealed interior. It created a small zone of warmth and light within a much larger open field. Water sources further anchored early human life. Rivers, lakes, and seasonal wetlands drew animals and supported plant growth. Human groups positioned themselves strategically near these resources, often returning to favorable locations across generations. Yet even repeated occupation did not produce heavy permanent architecture. The landscape itself remained the primary framework. Temporary shelters may have been constructed from branches, leaves, or animal hides, but such materials decompose quickly and leave limited archaeological traces. The scarcity of durable dwellings from this period aligns with the environmental logic of mobility. Climate instability during the Pleistocene reinforced flexibility. When rainfall patterns shifted or vegetation changed, groups moved. Geological evidence shows periods when the Sahara expanded and contracted, alternately blocking and opening migration routes. In such a dynamic setting, investing in fixed, long-lasting buildings would have reduced adaptability. Instead, survival depended on reading terrain, tracking seasonal cycles, and adjusting routes. This meant that daily life unfolded outdoors not as a philosophical preference, but as a biological necessity. Each generation born into these African landscapes inherited not only genes, but also behavioral traditions suited to open environments. Children observed adults scanning for game, gathering edible plants, and responding to distant sounds carried across wind. The sky was not a decorative backdrop. It signaled time of day, approaching storms, and seasonal change. The ground was not an abstract surface. It recorded footprints, tracks, and paths. When we return to the beginning of our species and examine the environments that shaped the first tens of thousands of years, we find no evidence of a world divided into interior and exterior in the modern sense. There was only varying degrees of exposure within a continuous landscape. This ecological starting point explains why living outside was not an unusual state in early human history. It was simply the condition under which human life began and stabilized across countless generations. The early human environments were not silent or still. They were layered with movement, sound, and shifting light. In East Africa, where many of the oldest Homo sapiens fossils have been found, the terrain often consisted of open savannas broken by acacia trees, seasonal rivers, and patches of woodland. Geological and paleo-environmental studies show cycles of rainfall that transform dry ground into green expanses and then back again. This rhythm shaped not only plant growth but also the migration routes of grazing animals. Human groups followed these rhythms closely because food availability depended on them. To live in such a world required daily exposure to open space. There was no alternative environment waiting indoors. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Olorgesailie in Kenya and Blombos Cave in South Africa reveals tool-making areas and signs of repeated occupation. Yet these were not enclosed settlements. Even caves that preserved traces of habitation were usually open-fronted shelters overlooking broader landscapes. They offered partial protection from wind and rain, but did not isolate their occupants from the surrounding ecosystem. The boundary between shelter and open air remained porous. Light entered freely. Sounds carried across distances. Temperature fluctuated with the sun. This permeability matters because it illustrates that early humans did not inhabit sealed interiors separated from weather and wildlife. Instead, they existed along gradients of exposure. The broader African climate during the Pleistocene was marked by variability, driven by orbital cycles that influenced monsoon patterns. Periods of increased rainfall expanded lakes and rivers, creating corridors for movement. Drier intervals contracted these resources, concentrating animals and humans near remaining water sources. Such variability reinforced mobility. Groups could not rely on a single fixed location for decades at a time without risk. Flexibility became a survival strategy, and flexibility is easier to maintain when dwellings are temporary and light. The outside was not merely a setting, it was the system within which decisions were made. Daily planning involved assessing wind direction, cloud formation, animal tracks, and the condition of vegetation. These assessments were not occasional observations but continuous processes. For children growing up in these environments, learning occurred through participation in outdoor tasks. Knowledge of edible plants, tool production, and animal behavior was embedded in physical movement across terrain. The landscape functioned as both classroom and resource base. When we consider population density during this long period, estimates suggest small, scattered groups spread across wide territories. The low density reduced pressure to construct compact, multi-layered housing. Space was available, and survival depended more on access to resources than on architectural permanence. Even when groups returned seasonally to the same favorable locations, they rebuilt light shelters rather than permanent structures. The archaeological record preserves stone tools and hearth remains because these materials endure, but the absence of durable walls reflects the ecological logic of the time. Returning again to the origin of our species, we see that the environmental baseline was one of openness, variability, and direct contact with natural forces. The human body and mind began their long evolutionary journey under these conditions. To ask why 80% of human history was spent outside is therefore to recognize that the outside was the primary habitat from the very beginning. It was not a temporary stage before civilization. It was the environment within which human life was calibrated across thousands of generations. As Homo sapiens gradually expanded beyond Africa beginning roughly 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, they did not leave the outdoor world behind. They carried with them a way of living already shaped by open landscapes. Genetic and archaeological evidence traces movements along coastal routes into Arabia, across South Asia, into Australia, and later into Europe and the Americas. In each region, climates differed, vegetation changed, and animal species varied. Yet one constant remained. Daily life unfolded primarily outside. There were no ready-made indoor environments waiting for them on new continents. Survival depended on adapting to new terrains rather than constructing sealed spaces detached from them. In the Levant and parts of Europe, caves and rock shelters were used more frequently, especially during colder periods. Sites such as Khavzeh in Israel or later Upper Paleolithic shelters in France show repeated human occupation. However, these spaces were not equivalent to modern houses. They were often seasonal refuges with open entrances facing valleys or plains. Light and airflow connected interior and exterior continuously. Even in Ice Age Europe, where colder temperatures encouraged the use of more substantial shelters, structures built from mammoth bones, wood, and animal hides remained temporary. Archaeologists have uncovered circular arrangements of bones interpreted as hut foundations, but these constructions were lightweight and responsive to local conditions. They did not create permanent indoor lifestyles insulated from the surrounding ecosystem. Climate variation across continents reinforced the importance of flexibility. During glacial periods, large parts of northern regions became uninhabitable due to ice coverage, pushing human groups southward. As glaciers retreated, new lands opened, inviting migration. Sea levels fluctuated dramatically, exposing land bridges such as Beringia between Asia and North America. These changes required movement and adaptation rather than architectural permanence. The environmental pressures shaping human expansion favored mobility, cooperation, and environmental awareness over the construction of heavy, fixed dwellings. Population density remained low across these vast territories. Estimates suggest that even 20,000 years ago, the global human population was only in the millions. With so few people spread across enormous landscapes, there was little structural pressure to compress life into enclosed, densely built spaces. Camps were established near water, food sources, or migration routes, then abandoned when conditions shifted. The outside was not simply endured, it was navigated strategically. Each new generation born into these expanding populations learned to interpret unfamiliar plants, animals, and weather patterns. Cultural knowledge accumulated, but it accumulated in direct relationship with open environments. Stone tools changed in form and sophistication, yet the fundamental context of their use remained outdoor terrain. Fire continued to provide warmth and protection, but it did not transform landscapes into permanent interiors. Even when artistic expression flourished, as seen in cave paintings in places like Lascaux, these artistic spaces were embedded within broader natural settings rather than urban neighborhoods. When we follow human migration step by step across continents, the pattern becomes steady and consistent. From African savannas to Eurasian plains to Australian coasts and American grasslands, human life unfolded beneath open skies. The diversity of environments was vast, but the structural condition of exposure persisted. Returning again to the question of proportion, we see that long before farming villages or fortified cities emerged, tens of thousands of years had already passed in which humans lived in constant interaction with outdoor surroundings. Expansion across the globe did not reduce that exposure. It multiplied it across different climates and ecosystems, reinforcing that for the overwhelming majority of our species' timeline, the outside world was the primary and unavoidable setting of human existence. If we look at the human body without assuming that modern buildings are normal, certain features begin to appear in a different light. Our skin regulates heat through sweating more efficiently than that of most mammals. Our eyes are adapted to perceive depth across long distances in open terrain. Our internal clocks respond closely to cycles of natural light and darkness. None of these traits emerged in sealed rooms. They stabilized over hundreds of thousands of years during which daily survival unfolded outdoors. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must consider not only archaeological timelines, but also the biological signatures carried in our physiology. One of the most distinctive human traits is endurance walking and running. Compared to other primates, humans possess long legs relative to body size, arched feet, and a spring-like Achilles tendon that stores and releases energy. The arrangement of our hips and spine supports upright posture over long distances. These features are not random. Paleoanthropologists have long argued that such adaptations facilitated movement across open landscapes, whether for foraging, tracking animals, or seasonal migration. Endurance in open terrain requires exposure to sun, wind, and shifting temperatures. It does not develop in confined, stationary environments. Thermoregulation provides another example. Humans have a high density of sweat glands and relatively little body hair compared to many mammals. This allows efficient cooling during sustained activity under direct sunlight. In hot savanna conditions, the ability to dissipate heat would have supported persistence hunting and long-distance travel. These adaptations make most sense in contexts where individuals were frequently outdoors, exposed to solar radiation and ambient temperature variation. They are less easily explained in a lifestyle dominated by indoor shelter. Vision also reflects open environment pressures. Human eyes are forward-facing, enabling binocular depth perception useful for judging distance. While this trait is shared with other primates, its utility in open savannas would have supported scanning horizons for predators or prey. Studies of hunter-gatherer populations in recent history show attentiveness to subtle environmental cues at considerable distances. Such perceptual skills are shaped through repeated outdoor experience across generations. Our circadian rhythms further reveal alignment with natural cycles. The suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain responds to light signals received through the retina, synchronizing sleep-wake patterns with sunrise and sunset. Before artificial lighting, exposure to dawn and dusk would have structured daily activity. Melatonin secretion rises in darkness and falls with morning light. These hormonal patterns evolved in contexts where night and day were defined by the sky rather than by electric illumination. Even aspects of our immune system bear traces of outdoor living. For most of human history, individuals were in constant contact with soil, plants, animals, and diverse microorganisms. While not all exposure was beneficial, immune responses developed within this ecological background. The body learned to distinguish between threats and tolerable environmental inputs in an open setting. Each of these features, locomotion, thermoregulation, vision, circadian timing, immune calibration, reflects long-term interaction with outdoor conditions. Returning again to the origin of our species, we find that these biological systems began stabilizing in African landscapes without permanent walls. Over thousands of generations, traits that supported survival in open environments were passed forward. The timeline reinforces the logic. If more than 11,000 generations lived before agriculture, then the biological framework we inherit today was shaped overwhelmingly by outdoor contexts. The body does not record historical dates, but it carries functional patterns refined under certain environmental pressures. When we examine those patterns carefully, they point consistently toward a past in which living outside was not an exception but the primary condition of human existence. If the human body carries structural signs of an outdoor past, the brain carries temporal ones. Neural systems governing attention, stress response, and sensory integration developed in conditions where information arrived from open, unpredictable surroundings. In early Homo sapiens populations, survival depended on detecting subtle changes in wind direction, animal calls, or shifting light across terrain. The brain evolved not in silence or uniformity, but within layered soundscapes and wide visual fields. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must consider how cognitive systems stabilized under these conditions. The human visual system, for example, is sensitive to movement at the edges of perception. Peripheral vision allows rapid detection of motion beyond the central focus of the eyes. In open landscapes, this capacity would have supported awareness of predators or prey approaching from a distance. Attention mechanisms in the parietal and frontal regions of the brain coordinate shifts in focus between near and far objects. Such flexibility aligns with environments where gaze regularly alternates between scanning horizons and examining nearby tools or plants. These patterns did not originate in enclosed rooms with limited depth cues. They emerged across thousands of generations in spaces where distance mattered. Auditory processing also reflects exposure to natural sound variability. The human ear distinguishes subtle differences in pitch and direction, aiding localization of sound sources. In open environments, wind, water, insects, birds, and mammals create complex acoustic layers, determining whether a distant noise signaled threat or opportunity required rapid interpretation. Neural circuits linking the auditory cortex with limbic structures allowed emotional responses to specific sounds, supporting quick decision-making. Such integration developed in landscapes without insulating walls to dampen external signals. Stress regulation offers another window into evolutionary context. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis coordinates hormonal responses to perceived danger. In open environments, threats were often immediate and situational. A predator sighting, a sudden storm, a conflict between groups. Stress responses would activate and then subside once the immediate event passed. These cycles were embedded in environments where visual and auditory cues were directly accessible. The calibration of stress systems occurred across long periods when exposure to the outside world was constant. Memory formation likewise depended on spatial navigation. The hippocampus, a brain structure central to memory and orientation, supports the creation of cognitive maps. Hunter-gatherer groups moving across large territories relied on remembering water sources, seasonal plant locations, and migration routes. Research on spatial memory in contemporary foraging populations suggests detailed environmental knowledge encoded through repeated outdoor movement. Such neural investment in spatial mapping makes sense in contexts where landscapes functioned as the primary framework for survival. Each time we return to the origin of our species in African savannas and follow the expansion across continents, we see cognitive systems shaped by open terrain. These systems stabilized over more than 11,000 generations before agriculture. The relatively recent emergence of dense, enclosed urban environments occupies a brief segment of neural history. The brain, like the body, reflects pressures repeated across deep time. It adapted to process light from unfiltered skies, sounds carried across wind, and spatial cues stretching beyond immediate reach. When we ask why 80% of human history was spent outside, part of the answer lies in this alignment between neural architecture and open environmental demands. The outside was not only where the body moved, it was where the brain learned to interpret the world. Beyond movement, vision, and stress regulation, even the chemistry of the human body reflects long exposure to open environments. Hormonal rhythms, vitamin synthesis, and sensory calibration developed under conditions where sunlight, temperature variation, and microbial diversity were constants rather than occasional experiences. When we return again to the origin of Homo sapiens in African landscapes, roughly 300,000 years ago, we are not only returning to open terrain, we are returning to the biological context in which these internal systems stabilized. This context helps explain why 80% of human history unfolded outside rather than within constructed interiors. Consider the role of sunlight in human physiology. Ultraviolet B radiation from the sun enables the skin to synthesize vitamin D, a compound essential for calcium absorption and bone health. While diet can provide some vitamin D, the primary evolutionary pathway for maintaining adequate levels was regular sun exposure. Variations in skin pigmentation across human populations are widely understood as adaptations to differing levels of solar radiation. Darker pigmentation in equatorial regions protects against excessive ultraviolet damage, while lighter pigmentation in higher latitudes facilitates sufficient vitamin D production under weaker sunlight. These patterns indicate long-term interaction with outdoor light environments. They do not reflect a species historically shielded from the sun for most of its existence. Temperature regulation also operates through daily fluctuations. The human body exhibits a natural rise and fall in core temperature over a 2-4 hour cycle, coordinated with light exposure and activity. Before artificial heating and cooling systems, Individuals experience gradual shifts in ambient temperature between day and night and across seasons. These variations interacted with metabolic rhythms. Research in chronobiology shows that exposure to natural temperature changes can reinforce circadian alignment. For thousands of generations prior to agriculture, the body's internal clocks synchronized not only to light, but also to environmental warmth and coolness experienced outdoors. Microbial exposure further illustrates evolutionary context. Soil, plants, animals, and untreated water harbor diverse microorganisms. While some pathogens posed risks, broad microbial contact also contributed to immune system training. Contemporary research into the hygiene hypothesis suggests that reduced exposure to environmental microbes in highly sanitized indoor settings may influence immune regulation. The evolutionary baseline, however, involved constant interaction with outdoor microbial ecosystems. The immune system developed patterns of tolerance and response within this broader ecological field. Each generation growing up in open camps or near water sources encountered microbial diversity as part of ordinary life. Even the senses of smell and touch bear traces of outdoor calibration. Olfactory receptors detect plant compounds, animal presence, smoke, and weather-related changes in air quality. Tactile sensitivity responds to wind, ground texture, and temperature gradients. These sensory systems were refined in contexts where physical contact with natural elements was frequent and necessary. When we examine the human organism as a whole, its hormonal cycles, pigmentation patterns, temperature rhythms, immune responses, and sensory capacities, we see coherence with long-term outdoor living. Returning repeatedly to the deep timeline of our species reinforces the proportion. More than 11,000 generations before agriculture, each shaped by direct exposure to natural light and climate. Only in the most recent fraction of that timeline have large populations spent the majority of time inside climate-controlled buildings. The biological framework we inherit today was assembled under different conditions. It was assembled in open air, beneath shifting skies, in environments where outside was not a destination but the enduring ground of human life. Before permanent houses, before insulated walls, night did not arrive as something that could be shut out. It descended gradually across open ground. The setting sun altered color and temperature, and human groups adjusted their behavior accordingly. For most of the 300,000 years since Homo sapiens first appeared in Africa, evening meant gathering in exposed landscapes, often around controlled fire, with darkness expanding beyond the reach of light. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must look closely at how our ancestors experienced the night itself. Fire, used regularly by early Homo sapiens and by earlier hominin species, extended activity beyond daylight hours. Archaeological evidence from sites in Africa and the Levant shows hearths containing charcoal and burned bone, indicating repeated use. Fire provided warmth, deterred some predators, and created a focal point for social interaction. Yet, even with fire, humans did not withdraw into sealed structures. The circle of light was limited, fading quickly into surrounding darkness. Beyond that boundary lay the same open environment that shaped daytime life. Nighttime rest in these conditions required different forms of security than modern locks or walls. Protection often depended on group size, strategic camp placement, and awareness of terrain. Camps were commonly situated near natural barriers such as cliffs or dense vegetation that reduced approach routes. In some regions, rock shelters and caves offered partial refuge, especially during colder periods or heavy rain. However, these spaces were rarely deep, closed interiors in the modern sense. Many opened directly onto plains or valleys, allowing airflow, light, and sound to move freely. The boundary between shelter and landscape remained thin. The archaeological record preserves limited physical traces of sleeping arrangements, yet ethnographic studies of recent hunter-gatherer societies provide cautious insight. Groups often slept in close proximity to one another, arranged around a central fire or within lightly constructed windbreaks. Materials such as branches, grasses, and animal hides formed temporary bedding and cover. These materials decayed over time, leaving little evidence for archaeologists, but their impermanence reflects a lifestyle oriented toward mobility. The night sky itself played a role in structuring experience. Without artificial illumination, Stars and moonlight provided orientation and seasonal markers. Knowledge of celestial patterns assisted navigation and timing of migrations. The circadian rhythms discussed earlier aligned closely with these natural light cycles. Melatonin secretion increased in darkness, preparing the body for sleep, while dawn light signaled the gradual return of activity. These hormonal patterns stabilized during countless nights spent in environments where darkness was complete and unfiltered by electric light. Climate variability further shaped nighttime experience. In equatorial regions, temperature drops after sunset could be moderate, while in more arid or high-altitude areas, they could be substantial. Humans adapted through clothing, fire management, and body positioning rather than through insulated architecture. Sleep occurred within the wider landscape, not apart from it. Returning again to the origin of our species, we see that for thousands of generations, night was not separated from the outside world by walls. It was encountered directly, managed collectively, and integrated into daily rhythms. Only in the last small fraction of human history have large populations come to experience darkness within sealed, temperature-controlled rooms. Measured against deep time, the dominant pattern was one in which even rest took place under conditions of exposure. The outside did not disappear when the sun went down. It remained the setting in which human life paused and resumed with each cycle of light. As darkness settled over prehistoric landscapes, human vulnerability increased, but so did collective coordination. Night did not eliminate exposure to the outside world. It intensified awareness of it. In the absence of permanent walls, protection depended on arrangement rather than enclosure. Archaeological evidence suggests that camps were organized with attention to wind direction, proximity to water, and visibility of surrounding terrain. Hearth placement was not random. Fire created a limited perimeter of light, and sleeping positions were often oriented relative to that center. This spatial organization indicates that rest occurred within an outdoor framework shaped by practical reasoning rather than architectural isolation. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must consider that even the most intimate human activity, sleep, remained embedded in open environments for the vast majority of generations. Ethnographic research among contemporary hunter-gatherer groups such as the Hadza of Tanzania or the San of southern Africa offers cautious parallels. These communities, while living in modern contexts, maintain patterns that may resemble aspects of ancient life. Individuals often sleep in close proximity, sometimes within light shelters constructed from branches and grass, sometimes under open sky when weather permits. Fires burn at the center of the camp through much of the night. Studies of sleep patterns in such groups show segmented sleep and brief awakenings, often synchronized with tending the fire or responding to sounds. These patterns suggest that human sleep evolved in environments where total isolation from external stimuli was neither possible nor adaptive. The acoustic environment of the night carried meaning. Distant animal calls, shifts in wind, or the crackle of vegetation could signal change. Rather than being shielded from these cues, early humans remained attuned to them even during rest. The brain's capacity to maintain low-level environmental monitoring during sleep aligns with this context. Light sleepers within a group could respond to disturbances, while others continued resting. Safety emerged from shared vigilance rather than from solid barriers. Climate further influenced nighttime strategies. In colder regions during glacial periods, people likely relied more heavily on caves or constructed windbreaks from available materials. Yet even in these cases, the structures were permeable. Smoke from hearths required ventilation, and entrances remained open for access. Archaeological sites across Europe and Asia reveal repeated cave occupations, but these caves functioned as seasonal refuges rather than sealed dwellings insulated from climate year-round. Airflow, ambient sounds, and shifting temperatures remain part of the sleeping environment. Returning to the deeper timeline, we see that more than 11,000 generations experienced night in direct contact with natural cycles. Darkness was profound without artificial lighting. The Milky Way was visible overhead, and moon phases structured movement and activity. Such exposure shaped circadian regulation across evolutionary time. Hormonal rhythms, including melatonin release, stabilized under conditions where night was genuinely dark and day genuinely bright. The contrast between light and dark was not diluted by screens or streetlights. When we place these realities against the relatively recent emergence of enclosed bedrooms with controlled lighting and temperature, the proportion becomes clear. For the overwhelming majority of human existence, sleep did not occur behind insulated walls. It unfolded in landscapes that remained accessible to sound, air, and sky. Night did not convert life into an indoor experience. It preserved the continuity of exposure, reinforcing that living outside was not limited to waking hours but extended through the full cycle of human existence. Over thousands of generations, the experience of night shaped more than sleep patterns. It shaped social bonds, memory, and communication. In open camps illuminated by firelight, evening became a time for shared activity that remained physically connected to the surrounding landscape. Archaeological evidence of hearth-centered spaces suggests that fire functioned not only as protection, but also as a social anchor. Around these fires, tools were repaired, food was prepared, and stories were likely exchanged. Yet even in these moments of relative safety, there were no solid barriers separating human conversation from wind, distant animal movement, or the cooling air of night. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must see that even culture itself matured in outdoor settings. The circle of light cast by a hearth did not erase darkness. It framed it. Beyond the illuminated area lay open terrain, and beyond that terrain stretched ecosystems active through the night. Predators hunted, insects moved, temperatures shifted. Human groups did not withdraw from these dynamics. They coexisted with them. Fire reduced certain risks, but it did not transform exposure into enclosure. The human nervous system learned to rest and to converse within this gradient of light and shadow. This long continuity of outdoor nights influenced generational transmission of knowledge. Skills necessary for survival tracking, plant identification, navigation were rehearsed and refined through lived experience in open environments. Even myths and early symbolic systems were likely informed by visible celestial patterns. Archaeological discoveries of engraved objects and cave art from the Upper Paleolithic suggest complex symbolic thought. These expressions emerged in societies where the sky was directly observed without obstruction. Seasonal constellations, lunar cycles, and shifting daylight lengths were practical markers of time and movement. Night was not hidden behind architecture. It was read and interpreted. Climate continued to shape nocturnal life. In tropical regions, night might bring cooling relief from daytime heat. In temperate or glacial zones, it required careful management of fire and shelter placement. Clothing made from animal skins, layered strategically, compensated for falling temperatures. Yet the reliance on clothing and fire rather than on insulated buildings reflects environmental logic. Materials were portable. Camps could be relocated. Adaptation favored mobility over structural permanence. When we return again to the origin of Homo sapiens and follow the timeline across continents, we see that the pattern persists. For over 11,000 generations before agriculture, night remained an outdoor experience in varying degrees of exposure. Even the most protective shelters did not create sealed interiors comparable to modern rooms. Only in the last small fraction of human history did architecture begin to redefine nighttime experience through thick walls, glass windows, and artificial light that extends day into darkness. Measured against deep time, such changes are recent adjustments layered upon a far older baseline. The majority of human ancestors never slept in temperature-controlled bedrooms or beneath electric light. Their nights unfolded within landscapes that continued to breathe, cool, and move around them. When we ask why 80% of human history was spent outside, part of the answer lies here, in the quiet repetition of nights lived without enclosure. Generation after generation, human rest, conversation, and imagination were shaped by exposure to sky and terrain. The outside did not pause at sunset. It remained the enduring context of human life, shaping even the hours when eyes were closed and voices lowered around a fading fire. Long before there were insulated rooms to soften the air, human ears learned to interpret wind moving across grass, insects vibrating at dusk, and distant hooves striking dry ground. Sound did not arrive through walls. It travelled across open terrain without obstruction. For the first 300,000 years of Homo sapiens' existence, acoustic experience was defined by landscapes rather than architecture. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must consider how weather and sound continuously shaped perception and behavior. In open environments such as African savannas or Eurasian plains, sound carries differently than in enclosed spaces. Wind direction alters how far voices and animal calls travel. Moist air at night can extend acoustic range, while midday heat can distort it. Early humans depended on subtle differences in volume and direction to locate prey, identify approaching predators, or recognize members of their own group. The auditory system evolved in this context of distance and variation. Neural circuits connecting the auditory cortex with motor responses allowed rapid orientation towards sound sources. Such responsiveness makes sense in environments where survival depended on real-time interpretation of outdoor cues. Weather also structured daily decision-making. Without roofs to shield from rain or thick walls to buffer temperature, human groups adjusted movement and activity in direct response to atmospheric change. Paleoclimatic records show that Pleistocene climates fluctuated between wetter and drier periods, with seasonal patterns that influenced plant growth and animal migration. In this setting, clouds were not aesthetic features but signals of approaching storms. Wind direction indicated shifts in temperature. The scent carried in the air could suggest water nearby or animal presence. Exposure to these variables was constant, and knowledge of them accumulated across generations. Archaeological evidence supports this environmental attentiveness. Camps were often positioned with awareness of prevailing winds and terrain contours. Hearths placed strategically reduced smoke inhalation and maximized warmth. Temporary windbreaks constructed from branches or hides were oriented to minimize exposure to gusts. These arrangements reflect practical engagement with weather rather than avoidance of it. Even in colder climates during glacial periods, adaptation relied on clothing, fire, and site selection rather than on permanent insulated housing. The body itself responded dynamically to environmental sound and temperature. The autonomic nervous system adjusts heart rate and breathing in response to sudden noises or cold exposure. Over thousands of generations, such physiological responsiveness stabilized in contexts where stimuli were varied and unpredictable. Unlike modern indoor environments that dampen acoustic variation, prehistoric soundscapes were layered and continuous. Silence, as defined by enclosed rooms, rarely existed. Instead, there were shifting degrees of natural sound. Returning to the origin of our species in African landscapes, we see that daily life unfolded within this acoustic and meteorological field. Children grew up learning to read the sky and to interpret the texture of air. Adults relied on these interpretations to plan movement and resource use. Across more than 11,000 generations before agriculture, such exposure was routine. Only in the last narrow segment of human history have large populations begun spending most hours within structures designed to reduce weather variability and filter external noise. Measured against deep time, these changes are recent layers placed upon a much older pattern of environmental immersion. For the majority of human existence, sound and weather were not background conditions. They were active forces shaping perception, timing, and survival in an outdoor world that defined the boundaries of life. Temperature was not a setting to be adjusted by a dial. It was a shifting condition that moved across skin, hour by hour, season by season. For the overwhelming majority of the 300,000 years since Homo sapiens first appeared, the human body existed in direct negotiation with heat, cold, humidity, and wind. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must look closely at how constant exposure to weather shaped daily rhythms, behavior, and physiology. In open environments, temperature follows predictable yet variable cycles. Mornings begin cool, heat rises toward midday, and evenings bring gradual decline. Across seasons, these patterns stretch or compress depending on latitude. For early human groups living in African savannas, Arabian coastlines, Eurasian steppes, or later in Ice Age Europe, adaptation required flexibility rather than insulation. Clothing made from animal hides, layered plant fibers, and strategic fire use provided protection, but these were responses within the outdoor world, not replacements for it. The outside remained the governing context. Archaeological findings show increasing sophistication in clothing technology during colder periods, including bone needles dated to tens of thousands of years ago. These tools suggest fitted garments designed to conserve heat. Yet even with improved clothing, humans continued moving across landscapes in direct contact with ambient conditions. Camps were positioned to reduce wind exposure, often near natural barriers or slight elevations to avoid flooding. These decisions reflect sensitivity to microclimates, rather than retreat into sealed structures. The human cardiovascular system responds dynamically to temperature variation. Blood vessels dilate in warmth to release heat and constrict in cold to preserve it. Sweating increases under direct sun, and shivering generates heat during cold exposure. These responses were rehearsed daily across thousands of generations. Unlike modern climate-controlled interiors that maintain narrow temperature ranges, prehistoric life required constant physiological adjustment. Such repeated exposure likely reinforced regulatory efficiency. The skin, the body's largest organ, functioned as an interface with shifting air currents and solar radiation. Returning again to the origin of our species, we find that these regulatory systems began stabilizing under equatorial sunlight and variable rainfall patterns. As humans migrated into higher latitudes, new challenges emerged, but the solution remained engagement rather than enclosure. Fire use intensified, clothing thickened, and seasonal movement adjusted, yet permanent insulated housing remained rare for most of this deep timeline. Even in regions where semi-subterranean dwellings eventually appeared, such as in some Arctic cultures much later, these adaptations occupy a very small fraction of overall human history. Humidity and air movement also played roles. Wind accelerates heat loss, influences scent dispersion, and alters comfort levels. In open camps, people oriented sleeping areas to minimize drafts while preserving ventilation to clear smoke from hearths. The balance between warmth and airflow required attentiveness. Knowledge of prevailing winds and seasonal weather patterns accumulated through observation rather than through reliance on structural barriers. Across more than 11,000 generations before agriculture, these negotiations with weather were ordinary and continuous. Only in the last few centuries have large populations lived predominantly in environments where temperature is mechanically stabilized and wind is excluded. Measured against deep time, such conditions are recent anomalies. For most of human existence, warmth and cold were not inconveniences to be eliminated, but realities to be understood and managed within the open world. The body adapted to that management, reinforcing that outside was not a temporary setting. It was the enduring climate within which human life unfolded. Beyond sound and temperature, light itself structured human experience in ways that only make sense in an outdoor world. For more than 300,000 years, the primary source of illumination was the sun by day and fire or moonlight by night. There were no electric bulbs to extend daylight indefinitely, no glass to soften glare, and no curtains to fully block dawn. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must consider how deeply natural light shaped perception, timing, and behavior across thousands of generations. In open landscapes, the angle of sunlight changes gradually from sunrise to sunset, altering shadow length and color tone. Early humans would have learned to interpret these shifts instinctively. Morning light signaled the beginning of activity. Midday brightness influenced hunting or gathering strategies, and the lowering sun indicated time to return toward camp. These patterns were not abstract schedules imposed by clocks. They were embedded in visible cycles of brightness and darkness. The retina contains specialized cells that respond specifically to light intensity, sending signals to brain regions that regulate alertness and hormonal balance. These systems evolved in direct response to unfiltered daylight. Artificial lighting is a very recent addition, appearing only in the closing moments of the human timeline. Before its widespread use, darkness after sunset was deep and consistent, particularly away from firelight. This contrast between day and night reinforced circadian stability across generations. Seasonal variation in daylight further shaped movement and social patterns. In equatorial regions, day length changes modestly throughout the year, while in higher latitudes, seasonal shifts become dramatic. As Homo sapiens migrated into Eurasia and beyond, they encountered longer summer days and shorter winter ones. These variations influenced hunting success, travel distance, and rest cycles. Yet adaptation again occurred through engagement rather than through insulation. People adjusted activity according to available light rather than eliminating darkness. The archaeological record provides indirect support for this alignment. Tool production sites and food processing areas are often associated with open-air locations where daylight was abundant. Even when caves were used, evidence suggests that deeper interior spaces required artificial light from torches or lamps, indicating that daylight remained the preferred working condition. Human visual acuity and color perception are optimized for natural daylight conditions, which provide a broad spectrum of wavelengths. This optimization developed over tens of thousands of generations spent outdoors. Light exposure also influences mood and cognitive performance. Modern research demonstrates that natural light regulates serotonin and other neurotransmitters involved in well-being. While we must be cautious not to project contemporary findings too simplistically onto ancient populations, it is reasonable to recognize that human neurochemistry stabilized in contexts of regular daylight exposure. The open sky was not merely overhead, it was a regulator of internal state. Returning once more to the beginning of our species, we see individuals waking with sunrise and reducing activity after sunset in landscapes without architectural barriers. Across more than 11,000 generations before agriculture, such patterns repeated with consistency. Only in the last small fraction of history have large populations lived primarily under artificial illumination within enclosed spaces. Measured calmly against deep time, this shift is recent. For the overwhelming majority of human existence, light moved across bodies without obstruction, shaping sleep, movement, and perception in an outdoor world that defined the boundaries of daily life. For most of human existence, there were no private rooms. There were no separate bedrooms, no doors that could be closed to create individual space. Social life unfolded in open air, within shared camps that blurred the line between personal and communal activity. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must examine how human relationships themselves developed in environments without architectural separation. Anthropological research on hunter-gatherer societies suggests that early human groups were typically small, often ranging between a few dozen individuals. These groups were mobile, forming flexible bands that shifted membership over time. Social interaction occurred in shared spaces defined by proximity rather than by walls. Cooking, tool-making, childcare, and conversation took place within sight and sound of one another. The absence of permanent structures meant that space was negotiated socially, not architecturally. When we return to the deep timeline beginning around 300,000 years ago in Africa, we find generations raised without the concept of enclosed domestic rooms. Children observed adult activity directly, learning through immersion in communal settings. There was little physical barrier between age groups. Knowledge transmission occurred outdoors, often around hearths or in activity areas defined by natural landmarks. The landscape itself structured gathering points such as shaded trees, riverbanks, or sheltered rock overhangs. These were open environments shaped by terrain rather than by constructed interiors. Archaeological evidence reinforces this picture. Excavations of prehistoric campsites reveal clusters of stone tools, food remains, and hearths arranged in patterns that suggest shared activity zones. There is little indication of rigid internal partitioning. Even in later Upper Paleolithic contexts where temporary huts were constructed, the scale remained small and communal. These shelters were likely used collectively rather than divided into private chambers. The design reflects environmental necessity and social cohesion, rather than a preference for individual enclosure. Living outside also influenced patterns of cooperation. In open environments, survival required collective awareness. Hunting large animals, defending against predators, and caring for children demanded coordination. Visual and auditory access to other group members supported rapid communication. The open-air setting facilitated this coordination. Voices carried without obstruction, gestures were visible across short distances, and communal fires created shared focal points. Social bonds were reinforced through proximity rather than through separation into discrete indoor units. Population density during most of human prehistory remained low. Vast territories separated small groups, reducing pressure to compress life into enclosed housing. Instead of vertical building or dense urban clustering, space extended horizontally. Camps could be rearranged or relocated as resources shifted. This fluidity shaped social organization, allowing alliances and kinship networks to expand and contract without permanent architectural constraints. Returning again to the question of proportion, we see that for more than 11,000 generations before agriculture, humans experienced daily life within open communal settings. Only in the final narrow segment of our species' timeline did fixed settlements introduce structural divisions such as walls, corridors, and private rooms. These innovations transformed social patterns, but they remain recent when measured against deep evolutionary time. The dominant pattern across human history was one in which relationships formed and stabilized under open skies, without enclosed interiors defining the boundaries of interaction. Living outside was not only a physical condition, it was the social framework within which cooperation, learning, and identity developed across thousands of generations. In open camps without permanent partitions, privacy as we understand it today had a different meaning. Personal space existed, but it was defined by distance and social norms rather than by walls. For most of the 300,000 years since Homo sapiens first appeared, daily routines unfolded within shared outdoor settings where visibility and audibility connected individuals continuously. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must consider how concepts such as individuality, hierarchy, and cooperation developed in environments that lacked architectural separation. Anthropological studies of recent hunter-gatherer groups provide careful insight into how space is organized without permanent structures. Sleeping areas may be loosely arranged by family units, yet they remain within a broader communal circle. Activities such as food preparation, storytelling, and tool repair take place within sight of others. Social norms regulate behavior, but enforcement relies on reputation and group consensus rather than on isolation behind closed doors. In such contexts, the environment itself remains visible and shared. The horizon, the trees, and the sky form the backdrop for interaction. Returning again to the early African environments where our species began, we find small, mobile bands navigating vast landscapes. Population density was low, reducing the need for defensive architecture or crowded housing. Mobility encouraged flexibility in group composition. Individuals could move between bands through kinship ties or marriage alliances, reinforcing networks across territories. These movements occurred outdoors, along paths shaped by rivers, seasonal plant growth, and animal migration routes. The landscape functioned as connective tissue linking communities. Archaeological evidence supports this mobility. Stone tools made from materials sourced many kilometers away indicate exchange or travel across open terrain. Such exchanges required communication and trust, built in shared spaces. There is little evidence of rigid, enclosed settlements during the long pre-agricultural period. Instead, clusters of hearths and activity zones suggest fluid arrangements adaptable to circumstance. The absence of heavy architecture allowed social structures to remain dynamic. Even conflict resolution likely unfolded in communal open areas rather than within secluded rooms. Cooperation in hunting or gathering required clear lines of sight and coordinated movement across terrain. Shared labor strengthened bonds, and shared exposure to weather reinforced mutual dependence. Without thick barriers separating individuals, social awareness remained high. Facial expressions, body posture, and vocal tone were visible and audible to the group. The nervous system evolved within this constant social exposure, calibrating responses to subtle cues from others. When we measure this pattern across more than 11,000 generations before agriculture, the continuity becomes clear. For the overwhelming majority of human history, social identity formed in settings where the outside world remained present. There were no corridors to isolate disagreements, no private offices to withdraw into. Even in later prehistoric villages that began to appear after agriculture, houses were small and often clustered tightly, with outdoor courtyards serving as primary gathering spaces. The fully enclosed indoor social life familiar to modern urban dwellers represents a very recent development. Returning once more to the proportion that defines this inquiry, we see that living outside shaped not only survival strategies but also the structure of human relationships. Open air was the medium through which cooperation, negotiation, and shared meaning developed. The architecture of society emerged within landscapes rather than within walls, reinforcing that the outside world was the enduring framework of human connection. In environments without permanent walls, generations did not inherit houses as fixed containers of memory. They inherited landscapes. Rivers, distinctive rock formations, groves of trees, and seasonal waterholes functioned as anchors of identity. For most of the 300,000 years since Homo sapiens first appeared, belonging was tied to territory rather than to architecture. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must recognize that place itself was defined by features of open land, not by constructed interiors. Anthropologists studying foraging societies consistently observe strong territorial knowledge transmitted across generations. Individuals can describe the location of water sources, edible plant clusters, and animal migration routes in remarkable detail. This knowledge is not abstract. It is embodied through repeated travel across terrain. Children learn by walking the same paths as parents and elders, absorbing stories associated with specific hills or river bends. The land becomes a living archive. Memory is mapped onto open space rather than onto rooms. Archaeological evidence aligns with this pattern. Stone tool distributions and repeated campsite layers indicate long-term familiarity with certain regions, yet without the permanence of heavy construction. Camps were revisited seasonally, but the structures themselves were temporary. What endured was not the building but the knowledge of the site. Even in later Upper Paleolithic Europe, where semi-structured huts appear, they remain modest and responsive to climate. The broader environment retained primacy. Identity formed around landscapes that could be navigated and interpreted, rather than around enclosed domestic spaces. This territorial orientation influenced social cohesion. Shared knowledge of routes and resources reinforced group bonds. Myths and oral traditions likely encoded geographic information, linking stories to visible landmarks under open sky. Without written records or monumental buildings, continuity depended on collective memory tied to terrain. The outside world was therefore not a neutral backdrop, but an active participant in cultural transmission. When agriculture eventually emerged around 10,000 years ago, a significant shift occurred. Land began to be modified more permanently through cultivation and settlement. Houses became more stable, and storage structures appeared. Yet even in early farming villages, much daily life continued outdoors in courtyards, fields, and shared spaces. The transition to predominantly indoor living would unfold gradually over millennia and accelerate only in recent centuries. Compared to the deep timeline of mobile foraging life, this shift remains brief. Returning again to the generational scale, more than 11,000 generations lived before agriculture reshaped spatial attachment. Those generations navigated territories defined by natural markers. Their sense of home expanded across valleys and plains rather than shrinking into enclosed rooms. The nervous system, memory structures, and social patterns stabilized within this framework of open land. When we measure human history calmly against this expanse, the proportion holds steady. The overwhelming majority of our ancestors did not orient their identity around private interiors. They oriented it around landscapes visible beneath open sky. Living outside was not only a matter of exposure to weather or light, it was the spatial foundation of belonging itself. The outside world carried history, memory, and meaning long before walls began to concentrate those functions within confined spaces. For most of human history, movement was not an occasional event. It was the organizing principle of life. Long before permanent settlements, before fields were planted and harvested year after year in the same place, human groups adjusted their location in response to water, animals, and seasonal change. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must examine mobility itself as the central strategy of survival across thousands of generations. Beginning around 300,000 years ago in Africa, early Homo sapiens inhabited environments that shifted over time. Rainfall patterns changed, rivers altered course, and herds migrated in search of fresh grazing grounds. In such a context, remaining fixed in one location for extended periods would have increased risk. Archaeological evidence from Middle Stone Age sites indicates repeated short-term occupations rather than continuous settlement. Layers of tools and hearth remains show cycles of arrival and departure. This pattern suggests that camps functioned as temporary nodes within broader movement networks. The outside world was not merely where people lived, it was the space through which they traveled regularly. Mobility influenced technology. Tools were designed to be portable, durable, and adaptable. Stone implements could be carried over long distances, and raw materials were sometimes transported far from their geological sources. This indicates planning and foresight shaped by the expectation of movement. Lightweight shelters constructed from branches, hides, or grasses could be assembled and dismantled quickly. Heavy permanent structures would have limited flexibility and tied groups to specific locations vulnerable to environmental fluctuation. Population density reinforces this logic. For much of prehistory, global human numbers remained low, often estimated in the hundreds of thousands or low millions. Vast territories separated small bands, allowing movement without immediate territorial conflict. Mobility reduced pressure on local resources and allowed ecological recovery between visits. Instead of building upward or inward, human groups expanded outward across landscapes. This outward orientation kept life rooted in open terrain. When we return to the deep timeline and divide it into generations, the pattern becomes even clearer. More than 11,000 generations lived before agriculture introduced widespread sedentism. For these generations, walking was a daily necessity rather than a recreational activity. Trails formed not as paved roads but as repeated paths across soil and grass. Children grew up accompanying adults on foraging routes, internalizing spatial memory through direct experience. The land itself became a map, carried in memory rather than a property marked by walls. Climate variability during the Pleistocene further encouraged movement. Glacial cycles reshaped habitats, pushing populations into new regions and opening corridors for migration. The expansion of Homo sapiens into Eurasia, Australia, and eventually the Americas reflects sustained mobility over tens of thousands of years. These migrations were not one-time events, but part of a broader pattern of flexible adaptation to open environments. Only in the final fraction of this timeline did agriculture encourage more permanent settlement patterns. Even then, early villages remained closely connected to surrounding fields and pastures, with much activity still conducted outdoors. Compared to the vast span of mobile foraging life, the era of predominantly indoor existence remains brief. The long arc of human history is defined not by walls but by paths, by repeated journeys across landscapes that demanded constant interaction with the outside world. Mobility did not only shape where humans lived, it shaped how they understood space and time. In a world without permanent settlements, distance was measured by walking hours rather than by street names, and seasons were tracked through changes in vegetation rather than by calendars pinned to walls. For the majority of the 300,000 years since Homo sapiens first appeared, movement across open terrain structured perception itself. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must see mobility not as a temporary phase before stability, but as the dominant rhythm of human life. Archaeological surveys across Africa and Eurasia reveal patterns of seasonal occupation. Camps appear near river valleys during dry months and shift toward higher ground when rains return. Animal remains found at different sites correspond to migration patterns of prey species, indicating that human groups followed these cycles closely. This behavior reflects ecological knowledge refined over generations. Rather than storing large surpluses of food within permanent buildings, early humans relied on timing and relocation. The outside world functioned as a moving resource map. Such mobility required detailed spatial memory. The hippocampus, central to navigation, encodes routes and landmarks. Studies of modern foraging populations show strong orientation skills developed through repeated travel over large areas. While we must be cautious in drawing direct parallels, it is reasonable to infer that similar capacities were essential for earlier generations. Children learned terrain by accompanying adults on gathering or hunting expeditions, absorbing topography through experience. This form of learning cannot occur within confined interiors. It depends on open landscapes. Social organization also reflected mobility. Bands could split into smaller groups when resources were scarce and merge again during periods of abundance. These fission-fusion dynamics reduced competition and allowed flexible adaptation to environmental variability. Open spaces facilitated such movement. There were no permanent walls restricting relocation, no fixed property boundaries enforced by architecture. Territory was understood through shared knowledge rather than through constructed barriers. Returning again to the deep timeline, we see that more than 11,000 generations lived within this pattern. Only around 10,000 years ago did agriculture begin to anchor people more consistently to particular plots of land. Even then, many communities practiced seasonal transhumance, moving livestock between grazing areas. The fully sedentary, indoor-dominated lifestyle familiar to many modern urban populations developed gradually and unevenly across regions. Compared to the immense span of mobile existence, it represents a brief adaptation layered onto a much older foundation. Climate fluctuations during the Pleistocene reinforced this foundation. Expanding glaciers, shifting deserts, and rising sea levels periodically altered available habitats. Groups that remained flexible in movement were more likely to survive. Mobility was not simply convenient, it was protective. The outside world was the stage across which these adjustments unfolded. When we calmly compare the long arc of migration and seasonal relocation with the recent emergence of fixed indoor living, the proportion remains steady. For the overwhelming majority of human history, life was organized around paths, crossings, and open routes. The outside was not an interruption between indoor moments. It was the continuous medium through which human survival, memory, and cooperation moved across time. Over thousands of generations, repeated movement across open terrain did more than provide food. It shaped how humans understood risk, opportunity, and adaptation. In a mobile world, survival depended on reading patterns and responding before scarcity became crisis. Camps were not permanent fixtures, but pauses within longer routes. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must recognize that mobility itself discouraged the development of heavy, enclosed structures and reinforced direct engagement with landscape. Archaeological records from Africa, the Levant, Central Asia, and later from Europe and the Americas show toolkits designed for transport. Stone blades, scrapers, and projectile points were compact and versatile. Raw materials were sometimes sourced dozens or even hundreds of kilometers away, suggesting networks of travel or exchange across open ground. Such patterns indicate anticipation of movement. When a group expects to relocate regularly, architecture remains light. Energy invested in large, permanent buildings would be lost upon departure. Instead, investment focused on knowledge, skill, and portable resources. Environmental unpredictability strengthened this pattern. During the Pleistocene, glacial and interglacial cycles altered vegetation zones repeatedly. Grasslands expanded and contracted. Lakes formed and disappeared. Coastlines shifted as sea levels rose and fell. Human groups that maintained mobility could follow emerging resource corridors. Those confined to fixed locations would have faced greater vulnerability. The outside world was therefore not simply where people happened to be. It was the adaptive field within which resilience developed. Mobility also influenced demographic structure. Small band sizes reduced strain on local ecosystems and allowed flexible regrouping. When resources declined in one area, families could join relatives elsewhere. This fluidity minimized long-term competition over enclosed territory. Social boundaries were negotiated through kinship and alliance rather than enforced through walls or fortifications. Even when defensive measures became necessary in later prehistoric periods, they appear relatively late compared to the vast earlier span of open, lightly structured living. Returning again to the generational scale clarifies the proportion. If we imagine approximately 12,000 generations since the emergence of Homo sapiens, more than 11,000 of them experienced life before agriculture reshaped settlement patterns. For those generations, daily routines included walking, scouting, and adjusting camp location in response to shifting conditions. The land was not static property, but dynamic terrain. Knowledge of its cycles carried more value than permanent architecture. Only in the last small segment of human time did large-scale sedentism become common. Even after agriculture began, many communities continued practicing seasonal movement, especially pastoral groups who moved livestock between grazing areas. Fully enclosed, year-round indoor life, dominated by fixed urban structures, represents an even more recent development, concentrated largely within the past few centuries. Measured against deep time, this shift is brief. The long continuity lies in the repeated act of moving across open spaces, setting temporary camps, and departing again when conditions changed. The outside world provided not only resources but flexibility. It demanded awareness, fostered planning, and reinforced cooperation across distance. For the overwhelming majority of human history, paths mattered more than walls. An adaptation unfolded under open sky rather than within permanent enclosures. Around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, in several regions of the world, a gradual shift began that would slowly alter the relationship between humans and space. In parts of the Fertile Crescent, communities started cultivating wild grains. In East Asia, rice and millet were domesticated. In Mesoamerica, maize emerged as a staple crop. These developments did not occur everywhere at once, nor did they immediately transform all aspects of life. Yet they marked the beginning of agriculture, a turning point that would eventually encourage more permanent settlement. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must examine this shift carefully and place it in proportion to the long span that preceded it. For nearly 290,000 years before agriculture, human groups lived primarily as hunter-gatherers, moving across landscapes in response to ecological cycles. Agriculture, by contrast, required tending specific plots of land over extended periods. Seeds were planted, irrigated, protected, and harvested according to seasonal rhythms tied to a fixed location. This investment in place gradually increased the value of remaining near cultivated fields. Storage structures appeared to preserve surplus grain. Simple dwellings became more stable as communities returned to the same sites year after year. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Jericho in the Levant or Çatalhöyük in Anatolia reveals early villages with mud brick houses and organized layouts. These settlements represent significant innovations, yet they occupy a very narrow segment of the human timeline. If we divide 300,000 years into 30 equal segments of 10,000 years each, agriculture appears only in the final one. Everything before it, 29 segments, consisted of life organized around mobility and open terrain. Even within early farming communities, the outside world remained central. Much of daily labor occurred in fields, along irrigation channels, or in shared courtyards. Houses were small, often clustered tightly, and built from locally available materials such as mud brick or wood. These materials required maintenance and were vulnerable to weather. The interior space provided shelter, but it did not eliminate outdoor engagement. Livestock needed grazing, crops required monitoring. Seasonal cycles still dictated activity. The turning point of agriculture, therefore, did not instantly create an indoor species. It introduced a gradual reorientation toward fixed land use. Over centuries and millennia, some settlements expanded into towns and eventually into cities with thicker walls and more complex infrastructure. Yet this process unfolded slowly and unevenly across regions. Large-scale urbanization is a phenomenon of the last few thousand years, and industrialized indoor life is even more recent. Returning again to the generational scale clarifies the proportion. If more than 11,000 generations lived before farming, only a few hundred generations have experienced agricultural settlement, and only a handful have known modern indoor dominance. From the perspective of evolutionary time, agriculture is a late chapter layered onto a much older narrative shaped by open environments. The beginning of farming did not erase the outdoor foundation of human life. It modified it incrementally. When we calmly compare the length of the agricultural era to the immense span of mobile foraging life, the imbalance remains clear. The majority of human existence unfolded before fields were fenced or houses built in rows. Agriculture represents a significant transformation, but it occupies only the closing fraction of a much longer story rooted in open landscapes. The adoption of agriculture did not occur in a single moment, nor did it immediately transform every community into a permanently enclosed society. Early farming was gradual, experimental, and often combined with continued hunting and gathering. In regions such as the Fertile Crescent, archaeological layers show long periods in which wild cereals were harvested before full domestication took place. This transitional phase reminds us that the shift from mobility to settlement was slow, measured in centuries rather than in years. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must see that even after agriculture began, outdoor life remained dominant for a long time. Early villages consisted of modest structures built from mud brick, wood, or stone. At sites like Çatalhöyük, houses were constructed closely together, yet much activity occurred on rooftops or in shared exterior spaces. Fields lay beyond the settlement, requiring daily labor under open sky. Irrigation channels needed maintenance. Livestock required grazing and protection. The architectural interior expanded gradually, but it did not replace outdoor engagement. The majority of working hours still unfolded in direct contact with soil, weather, and seasonal light. Agriculture increased food production in some regions, allowing populations to grow. As numbers expanded, settlements became denser. Storage facilities and defensive walls appeared in certain locations. These developments represent meaningful changes in spatial organization. Yet even at this stage, the proportion of human history spent in fully enclosed, climate-controlled indoor environments remained extremely small. The buildings of early farming societies were permeable. Smoke escaped through openings. Light entered through doorways or roof gaps. Floors were earthen. Airflow connected interior and exterior continuously. Climate variability continued to shape agricultural life. Droughts, floods, and temperature fluctuations affected harvests. Communities responded by adjusting planting strategies, diversifying crops, or relocating when necessary. Sedentism reduced mobility compared to foraging life, but it did not eliminate dependence on open environmental conditions. The outside world remained decisive in determining survival. Returning again to the deep timeline of 300,000 years, the agricultural period occupies only the final portion. If we imagine a line stretching from the emergence of Homo sapiens to the present, the shift to farming appears near the very end. More than 11,000 generations lived entirely before this transformation. Only a few hundred generations experienced early village life. Even fewer have known large cities with multi-story buildings and sealed interiors. From an evolutionary perspective, the human body and brain were shaped overwhelmingly during the long era of mobile, outdoor existence. Agriculture began a new chapter, but it did not erase the biological and behavioral patterns formed earlier. Instead, it layered new social and spatial structures onto an older foundation rooted in open landscapes. When we compare the time spent in small farming villages to the vast span of life before cultivation, the imbalance remains striking. The rise of agriculture marks an important transition, yet it remains a recent adaptation in the broader arc of human history. The outside world continued to define daily labor, social interaction, and environmental risk for millennia after crops were first planted. Only in the most recent centuries has indoor life begun to dominate human experience in a way that would have been unfamiliar to the overwhelming majority of our ancestors. As agricultural villages expanded into early towns, a gradual architectural thickening began. Walls became more substantial. Storage rooms multiplied. Defensive structures appeared in certain regions where conflict or resource competition intensified. Yet even in these emerging settlements, the outside world did not disappear from daily life. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must place the rise of towns and proto-cities within the broader timeline and examine how limited their reach remained for most of human existence. By around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, urban centers began forming in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, parts of Egypt, and later in Mesoamerica and China. These early cities introduced more complex building patterns, including multi-room houses, courtyards, and public structures. However, global population at that time was still relatively small compared to modern numbers, and the majority of humans did not live in cities. Many communities continued as small-scale farmers, pastoralists, or foragers. Even within cities, much activity remained outdoors. Markets operated in open squares. Craft production often took place in courtyards or near entrances. Streets were unpaved and exposed to weather. Architecture provided shelter, but it did not seal inhabitants away from environmental conditions in the way modern construction does. Materials such as mud brick, timber, and thatch required constant maintenance and allowed airflow. Windows were small or absent in many structures, but openings for smoke, ventilation, and light ensured connection with external climate. Seasonal temperature changes still influenced daily rhythms. Without mechanical heating or cooling, inhabitants adapted through clothing, scheduling, and architectural orientation rather than through climate isolation. Agriculture itself continued to anchor most labor outdoors. Fields lay beyond city walls. Irrigation systems required oversight. Animal husbandry demanded grazing land. Even in societies with monumental architecture, The majority of the population worked in direct contact with soil and sky. The proportion of time spent inside enclosed spaces remained limited relative to modern standards. Returning once more to the generational scale clarifies the imbalance. If more than 11,000 generations lived before agriculture, and perhaps 200 to 300 generations experienced early urban development, the overwhelming majority of human ancestors never knew cities at all. Even among those who did, indoor life occupied only part of the day. Fully enclosed, insulated buildings with artificial lighting and temperature control would not become widespread until the last 2 centuries. Measured against 300,000 years, that span is almost imperceptible. The turning point of agriculture and urbanization was significant in shaping social complexity, governance, and trade. Yet it did not instantly transform humans into indoor dwellers. The outdoor world remained central to production, movement, and communication. Only gradually did architecture grow denser and more compartmentalized. Even then, such changes were geographically uneven and socially stratified. Large segments of humanity continued living in rural settings with strong dependence on open land. When we calmly compare the length and scale of early urban life to the immense duration of mobile foraging existence, the proportion remains steady. The outside world framed human survival for tens of thousands of years before towns appeared, and it continued to frame daily labor long after. The emergence of cities marks a visible shift in the story of our species, but it occupies a narrow band within a much wider landscape of open living that defines the majority of human time. For thousands of years after the first cities appeared, walls remained thin experiments rather than dominant realities. Stone foundations, mud brick houses, and defensive fortifications gradually altered landscapes, yet they did not redefine the human condition on a global scale. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must examine how recent the idea of living primarily indoors truly is, when measured against the full span of our species' existence. Early urban centers such as Uruk in Mesopotamia or Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley introduced denser settlement patterns and more complex architectural planning. Streets were laid out with intention, houses clustered together, public buildings rose above surrounding structures. These developments signaled growing social complexity. Yet even in these contexts, the materials used for construction were vulnerable to climate. Mud brick eroded in rain, timber decayed, roofs required repair. Buildings were maintained in ongoing dialogue with weather rather than sealed against it. The outside world continued pressing against walls. Most people in ancient civilizations did not live in monumental structures. They inhabited modest dwellings that opened directly onto courtyards or streets. Daily routines involved drawing water, tending animals, farming fields, and trading goods in open marketplaces. Architectural interiors provided shelter, but they did not dominate waking life. Artificial lighting was limited to oil lamps or torches, and heating relied on hearths. Seasonal temperature changes still governed comfort and productivity. The rhythm of sunrise and sunset structured work schedules in ways similar to earlier periods. If we return again to the generational scale, the picture becomes clearer. Suppose we consider approximately 12,000 generations since the emergence of Homo sapiens. The number of generations living in large urban settlements would account for only a small fraction of that total. Even within those generations, the proportion of time spent in enclosed interiors remained limited compared to modern standards. Only with the advent of industrialization in the last 2 centuries did architecture begin to incorporate widespread glass windows, centralized heating, and later mechanical cooling systems. These innovations gradually expanded indoor occupancy time, especially in colder or hotter climates. The Industrial Revolution marked a qualitative shift. Factories, offices, and apartment buildings encouraged longer hours within constructed environments. Electric lighting extended activity deep into the night. Urban populations expanded dramatically, compressing human life into multi-story structures. Yet when placed against 300,000 years of evolutionary history, these changes occupy an extremely narrow slice. They represent a late-stage modification layered onto a biological framework shaped outdoors. Returning to the deep past where our species first stabilized in African landscapes, we find bodies and brains calibrated for open air, variable weather, and natural light cycles. The rise of durable architecture and industrial infrastructure has been rapid relative to evolutionary time. It has occurred within a handful of recent generations. For the overwhelming majority of human ancestors, walls were temporary boundaries rather than primary habitats. The outside world defined work, movement, and social interaction. When we calmly compare the scale of industrial indoor life with the immense span that preceded it, the imbalance remains evident. Permanent walls and climate-controlled interiors are modern experiments. They occupy the closing pages of a story that was written mostly under open sky. The transformation from occasional indoor shelter to predominantly indoor living did not happen with the first cities. It accelerated much later, especially during the last 2 centuries. Until the modern era, even urban populations remained closely tied to outdoor labor and environmental rhythms. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must examine how recent the large-scale migration of daily life into enclosed spaces truly is. Before the 19th century, most work occurred outdoors or in partially open workshops. Agriculture employed the majority of people in nearly every region. Crafts such as blacksmithing, pottery, and textile production often took place in spaces with wide openings for light and ventilation. Markets were held in open squares. Transportation depended on walking, animals, or boats exposed to weather. Houses, even in cities, were rarely sealed environments. Windows lacked modern insulation. Heating was localized to fireplaces. Air moved freely through cracks and gaps. Daily existence still required negotiation with temperature, humidity, and natural light. The Industrial Revolution began to alter this pattern. Factories concentrated labor inside large buildings designed to house machinery. Steam power and later electricity reduced dependence on daylight. Artificial lighting extended working hours beyond sunset. Urbanization intensified as people moved toward industrial centers. Multi-story apartment buildings and office structures multiplied. These changes gradually increased the proportion of time spent indoors, especially in industrialized regions. Yet even this shift is extremely recent in generational terms. If we estimate approximately 25 years per generation, the period since widespread industrialization spans only 8 to 10 generations. Compared to the more than 11,000 generations that lived before agriculture, this number is minimal. The rapid expansion of indoor infrastructure occurred too recently to reshape fundamental biological adaptations formed over deep time. Climate control technologies further accelerated the trend. Central heating, mechanical ventilation, and air conditioning reduced seasonal discomfort. Glass windows allowed light without exposure to wind. Elevators enabled vertical living in dense urban towers. Offices, schools, and shopping centers became enclosed environments where large populations spent extended hours shielded from outdoor conditions. These innovations created comfort and efficiency, yet they represent a radical departure from the environmental context that shaped most of human evolution. Returning again to the origin of Homo sapiens in African landscapes, the contrast becomes clear. For hundreds of thousands of years, the sky was the ceiling of human life. Even after villages and cities emerged, outdoor labor and exposure remained dominant for millennia. Only in the final moments of our timeline has architecture become dense enough and technology powerful enough to enclose daily routines almost completely in some societies. Globally, this transformation remains uneven. Many populations continue to rely heavily on outdoor work, especially in agriculture and resource-based economies. Nevertheless, in industrialized urban settings, the proportion of time spent indoors has risen sharply. When placed against the long arc of human history, this shift occupies a narrow band at the end. The dominance of indoor living is not an ancient norm, but a recent experiment unfolding within a species shaped overwhelmingly by open environments. The outside world framed survival for nearly all of our existence. Only very recently have walls begun to redefine the boundaries of daily life for large segments of humanity. In the last century, the balance shifted more dramatically than at any previous point in human history. Urban populations expanded rapidly, and architecture grew taller, denser, and more insulated. Electricity became universal in many regions. Artificial lighting dissolved the natural boundary between day and night, and mechanical systems stabilized temperature regardless of season. For the first time, large numbers of people began spending most of their waking and sleeping hours within enclosed, climate-controlled interiors. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must see how recent and concentrated this indoor transformation truly is. Statistical studies in industrialized nations indicate that many individuals now spend close to 90% of their time indoors or inside vehicles. Work occurs in offices or factories. Education takes place in classrooms. Leisure unfolds in homes, cinemas, and shopping centers. Digital communication reduces the need for physical movement across terrain. These patterns would have been unfamiliar to the overwhelming majority of our ancestors. Even in ancient cities, daily life still required outdoor labor and direct engagement with weather. The contemporary indoor lifestyle compresses human activity into constructed environments in ways unprecedented in deep time. This compression has unfolded within only a few generations. If we consider again the roughly 12,000 generations since Homo sapiens emerged, the number who have experienced fully electrified, climate-controlled indoor life is perhaps 5 or 6 at most. From an evolutionary perspective, this span is almost negligible. Biological systems calibrated under open skies have not had time to adapt genetically to such rapid environmental change. The architecture of our bodies and brains still reflects pressures repeated across tens of thousands of years spent outdoors. Modern buildings are engineered to exclude variability. Windows are sealed, air is filtered, sound is dampened, light is programmable, temperature is constant. These features enhance comfort and productivity, yet they represent a departure from the fluctuating environments in which human physiology and social structures developed. The outside world, once the dominant context of life, has become something scheduled or optional for many people. Parks, sidewalks, and recreational spaces provide contact with open air, but they are often brief interludes between longer indoor periods. Returning once more to the beginning of our species in African landscapes, the contrast is stark. For more than 290,000 years before agriculture, daily life unfolded under unfiltered light and variable climate. Even after villages and cities emerged, outdoor labor remained central for millennia. Only within the last 2 centuries has architecture begun to enclose the majority of human time in some regions. Measured against the full arc of 300,000 years, this indoor dominance occupies a narrow sliver at the end of the timeline. The numerical imbalance remains steady. For at least 80% of our species' history, the outside world defined the boundaries of existence. Walls are recent structures in evolutionary terms. The open sky, shifting weather, and expansive terrain form the enduring backdrop against which human biology, culture, and movement stabilized across thousands of generations. When the environment changes faster than biology can adapt, a gap begins to appear between inherited design and current conditions. The human brain, shaped over hundreds of thousands of years in open landscapes, now operates for many people within enclosed, highly regulated spaces. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must examine how this rapid environmental shift interacts with neural systems that stabilized long before walls became dominant. The brain evolved to process dynamic sensory input. In African savannas and later across Eurasian plains, information arrived from multiple directions at once. Shifting light, distant movement, changing wind, layered sounds. Attention systems developed flexibility to alternate between focused tasks and broad environmental scanning. The prefrontal cortex supports planning and decision-making, while deeper structures such as the amygdala respond to potential threats. These systems were calibrated in environments where unpredictability was constant and where exposure to natural variation was unavoidable. In modern indoor settings, sensory variability is reduced and often controlled. Artificial lighting minimizes changes in brightness. Climate control stabilizes temperature. Soundproofing dampens external noise. Screens provide concentrated visual stimuli within limited fields of view. These conditions differ sharply from the open environments that shaped neural regulation across more than 11,000 generations before agriculture. The speed of change matters. Agriculture altered settlement gradually over thousands of years. Industrialization and electrification transformed daily routines within a few centuries. Widespread digital technology has compressed that shift into mere decades. From an evolutionary perspective, these intervals are brief. Genetic adaptation operates over long spans, and while cultural practices can shift quickly, biological systems remain anchored to deeper timelines. Circadian regulation illustrates this tension. The suprachiasmatic nucleus synchronizes internal rhythms with natural light cycles. Exposure to bright screens late at night can delay melatonin release, altering sleep timing. While such disruptions are manageable, they highlight how modern indoor lighting differs from the consistent sunrise and sunset patterns experienced for most of human history. The brain's timing systems formed under predictable solar cycles, not under constant artificial illumination. Stress processing offers another example. In open environments, threats were immediate and situational, a predator sighting or sudden weather event. The stress response activated and then subsided. In modern contexts, psychological stressors such as deadlines or social evaluation may persist without clear physical resolution. Although this shift is complex and influenced by many factors, it underscores how neural systems shaped in outdoor conditions now operate in environments with different patterns of stimulus and relief. Returning again to the origin of Homo sapiens clarifies the scale. For the overwhelming majority of our species' existence, the brain processed information in landscapes without architectural isolation. Only within the last small fraction of the timeline have large populations lived predominantly indoors under artificial conditions. This does not imply that indoor life is inherently harmful or that past conditions were ideal. It simply reveals a rapid environmental transformation layered upon neural systems refined outdoors. When we compare the deep stability of evolutionary shaping with the speed of modern change, the proportion remains steady. The brain we carry today was assembled under open skies, and its architecture reflects a history in which the outside world was the primary context of perception and adaptation. Beyond circadian timing and stress response, attention itself reflects an outdoor origin. For hundreds of thousands of years, human awareness operated within environments that demanded alternating modes of focus. In open landscapes, individuals shifted between concentrated tasks such as shaping a tool or preparing food, and wide-angle scanning of surroundings for movement or change. This rhythm between focused and diffuse attention stabilized across more than 11,000 generations before agriculture. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must examine how these attentional patterns formed and how they differ from many contemporary indoor conditions. Cognitive scientists sometimes distinguish between directed attention and what is called soft fascination. Directed attention involves deliberate concentration on a specific task, requiring effort and control. Soft fascination refers to gentle engagement with stimuli that hold interest without demanding intense focus, such as watching clouds move or listening to wind in trees. In outdoor settings shaped by variable light, texture, and sound, both modes naturally alternated. The landscape itself provided subtle, shifting input that allowed attention to rest and reset between tasks. This pattern developed long before the emergence of enclosed offices or screen-based work. Modern indoor environments often compress attention into sustained, directed focus. Artificial lighting remains constant. Visual fields may be dominated by close-range screens. Auditory input is filtered or repetitive. While such conditions enable complex tasks, they differ from the broad, layered stimuli that characterize prehistoric environments. The human attentional system, formed in open terrain, may experience these changes as shifts in balance rather than as seamless continuity. Spatial perception also reflects outdoor calibration. In open landscapes, distance cues vary across long horizons. Depth perception integrates changes in scale, texture gradients, and atmospheric perspective. These visual processes stabilized in contexts where individuals regularly navigated large territories. Indoors, distances are shorter and more uniform. Visual reference points are confined within walls. Although the brain adapts functionally, the environmental input differs significantly from that which shaped perceptual systems over deep time. Returning again to the evolutionary baseline in African savannas, we see daily life unfolding in broad visual fields. Children observed adults scanning terrain, tracking animals, and reading subtle environmental cues. Memory formation integrated these spatial experiences, reinforcing neural circuits for navigation and pattern recognition. Over thousands of generations, these circuits became reliable components of human cognition. The transition to predominantly indoor life has occurred rapidly relative to that timeline. Only a handful of recent generations have grown up in environments where horizons are rarely visible and where attention is frequently drawn to close-range digital interfaces. From a biological perspective, this shift represents a sudden alteration in stimulus structure, layered upon long-standing neural architecture. This observation does not imply that modern environments are inherently incompatible with human cognition. Rather, it highlights proportion. For the overwhelming majority of our species' history, attention was exercised in open air, across variable landscapes, under changing light. The brain's flexibility emerged within that context. When we ask why 80% of human history was spent outside, part of the answer lies here. Our attentional systems were assembled in environments that required continuous interaction with broad, dynamic terrain rather than with enclosed, stabilized interiors. Memory, like attention, developed in relationship to terrain. For most of the 300,000 years since Homo sapiens emerged, remembering was not primarily about recalling written information stored in books or devices. It was about recalling routes, seasons, water sources, and the subtle patterns of animal behavior across landscapes. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must look at how memory systems stabilized within environments where survival depended on accurate spatial and ecological knowledge. The hippocampus, a structure central to memory formation and navigation, constructs internal maps of space. Neuroscientific research has identified specialized cells that activate in relation to location and direction. These systems allow humans to orient themselves, track distance, and remember pathways. In prehistoric contexts, such capacities were not optional skills but essential tools. A misremembered water source during drought or an incorrect migration route could have severe consequences. Across more than 11,000 generations before agriculture, individuals repeatedly relied on outdoor navigation to sustain life. Cultural memory also reflected open environments. Oral traditions encoded knowledge about landscape features, seasonal cycles, and social boundaries. Stories were tied to specific places: a bend in a river, a distinctive rock formation, a valley where certain plants grew. In the absence of permanent written records, continuity depended on shared recollection anchored in visible terrain. These memories were rehearsed through travel and storytelling under open sky, often around hearths situated within broader landscapes. The environment itself functioned as a mnemonic structure. In modern indoor contexts, memory tasks often involve abstract information detached from physical terrain. Navigation may rely on digital mapping rather than on embodied route learning. Written language and data storage have transformed the way knowledge is preserved. These innovations offer clear advantages, yet they differ from the ecological memory systems that shaped human cognition over deep time. The speed of this transformation is striking. Widespread literacy, printing, and digital technology occupy only the final portion of the human timeline. The neural architecture supporting spatial memory, however, was assembled long before these tools existed. Returning again to the origin of our species in African landscapes clarifies the scale. For hundreds of thousands of years, children learned by walking terrain alongside elders, absorbing environmental cues through repetition. The sky, the wind, and the ground formed a consistent backdrop for encoding experience. Even after agriculture introduced more stable settlements, much knowledge remained tied to fields, grazing routes, and seasonal weather patterns. Only in the recent urban era has large-scale indoor living reduced daily reliance on extended outdoor navigation. From an evolutionary perspective, this change is compressed into a small number of generations. Biological adaptation to entirely new cognitive demands requires far longer spans. The proportion remains steady. The memory systems we inherit today were shaped overwhelmingly in open environments where landscapes acted as living reference points. When we ask why 80% of human history was spent outside, part of the answer lies in the architecture of memory itself. It evolved to map terrain, track movement, and encode ecological knowledge within a world defined by sky and horizon rather than by walls and corridors. When a species spends hundreds of thousands of years adapting to one type of environment and then shifts rapidly into another, Biologists describe the situation as a mismatch. The term does not imply failure or catastrophe. It simply names the gap between the conditions under which traits evolved and the conditions in which those traits now operate. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must examine this idea carefully and place it within the long arc of human time. For approximately 300,000 years, Homo sapiens lived primarily in open landscapes shaped by variable light, shifting temperature, and direct engagement with terrain. Across more than 11,000 generations before agriculture, biological systems stabilized under those pressures. The body learned to regulate heat through sweating and vascular adjustment. The brain synchronized sleep with sunrise and sunset. Memory systems mapped routes across valleys and plains. Social bonds formed in communal outdoor spaces. These patterns were repeated consistently across deep time. Agriculture, urbanization, and eventually industrialization introduced new spatial arrangements. Yet the transition unfolded unevenly and relatively quickly when measured against evolutionary timescales. The fully enclosed, climate-controlled indoor environment familiar to many modern populations has existed for only a handful of generations. Genetic adaptation requires many cycles of reproduction under stable selection pressures. Cultural change, by contrast, can accelerate rapidly. The current human condition reflects this difference in speed. Our cultural tools have reshaped space faster than our biology can recalibrate. Consider light exposure. The circadian system evolved in predictable cycles of day and night. Artificial illumination now extends activity beyond sunset and reduces darkness in urban areas. While humans adapt behaviorally by adjusting schedules, the underlying biological clock remains calibrated to solar rhythms. Similarly, thermal regulation systems developed under fluctuating outdoor temperatures. Constant climate control reduces variability but does not alter the physiological mechanisms assembled over thousands of generations. The concept of mismatch also applies to movement. For most of human history, daily survival required walking, lifting, and sustained physical activity in open terrain. Sedentary indoor lifestyles reduce these demands. Musculoskeletal and metabolic systems evolved in contexts of regular movement. When movement decreases sharply, the body responds according to its inherited design, not according to modern expectations. Returning again to the origin of our species clarifies the scale of this contrast. The baseline environment for Homo sapiens was one of exposure rather than enclosure. Open air, broad horizons, and seasonal cycles defined existence for the overwhelming majority of our timeline. The indoor dominance of recent centuries represents a narrow layer at the end of that history. The mismatch concept does not romanticize the past or condemn the present. It simply highlights proportion. The biological framework we carry today was assembled in outdoor settings and remains largely shaped by those ancestral conditions. When we ask why 80% of human history was spent outside, part of the answer lies in this deep calibration. The outside world was not incidental. It was the environment that molded the systems we still depend upon, even as our cultural environments shift rapidly around us. The idea of mismatch becomes clearer when we place it against the full scale of human generations. If more than 11,000 generations lived before agriculture, and only a few hundred experienced settled farming life, then the number who have known industrial, climate-controlled indoor existence is extremely small. Biological traits are not erased simply because architecture changes. They persist, carrying the imprint of long repetition under earlier conditions. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must look at how deeply those earlier conditions shaped regulation systems that remain active today. Human sleep offers a measured example. For most of our species' history, sleep occurred in direct relation to sunset, firelight, and dawn. Darkness was profound. Morning light entered unfiltered. The circadian system evolved under these predictable cues. In modern settings, artificial light delays sleep onset, and indoor illumination can blur the contrast between day and night. The brain adjusts behaviorally, yet the hormonal machinery that regulates melatonin secretion was assembled in environments defined by natural light cycles. The shift has occurred within only a few generations, too quickly for genetic recalibration. Movement patterns provide another illustration. The human musculoskeletal system reflects an evolutionary past of walking long distances, carrying loads, and maintaining endurance. Bones remodel in response to mechanical stress. Muscles strengthen with use. For thousands of generations, daily activity demanded physical engagement with open terrain. In many contemporary contexts, sedentary work dominates. Chairs, vehicles, and elevators reduce movement. The body's regulatory systems still expect regular mechanical input shaped by ancestral patterns, yet the environment no longer requires it at the same frequency. This is not a moral judgment, but a biological observation grounded in proportion. Even social exposure reflects ancestral calibration. For most of human existence, social interaction occurred face-to-face in shared outdoor spaces. Voices traveled without electronic mediation. Facial expressions were visible across communal camps. In modern indoor environments, digital communication supplements or replaces direct interaction. While these tools expand connectivity, they also alter sensory input patterns that shape neural processing over deep time. The mismatch concept does not claim that modern life is inherently incompatible with human biology. Humans are remarkably adaptable. Cultural innovation allows rapid adjustment to new conditions. Yet adaptation at the genetic level unfolds slowly. When environmental change compresses into a few centuries, inherited systems continue operating according to much older calibrations. Returning again to the origin of Homo sapiens in African landscapes reminds us of that baseline. For hundreds of thousands of years, exposure to open air, variable weather, and direct light defined daily rhythms. Agriculture altered settlement gradually, and urbanization intensified enclosure, but the most dramatic shift toward indoor dominance has occurred within the last 2 centuries. Measured against 300,000 years, that interval is brief. The outside world shaped the majority of our biological architecture. Walls and climate control represent recent cultural layers added atop systems forged in open environments. When we calmly examine the numbers, the proportion remains steady. The human organism was assembled during a long outdoor era, and that legacy continues to influence how we respond to the indoor world we now inhabit. When we step back and view the entire arc of human time, mismatch is not a dramatic rupture but a matter of scale. The human organism carries systems refined across roughly 300,000 years of primarily outdoor living. The indoor dominance of the last 2 centuries represents a thin layer placed upon that foundation. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must hold both truths at once. Humans are adaptable, yet adaptation unfolds across deep time. Cultural change can be rapid, but biological calibration is gradual. Across more than 11,000 generations before agriculture, exposure to open environments was constant. Light varied naturally from dawn to dusk. Temperature rose and fell with weather. Sound traveled across terrain without insulation. Movement across land was routine. These repeated conditions shaped regulatory systems that still govern sleep, metabolism, attention, and stress response. They also shaped expectations about space, distance, and social presence. When architecture thickened and cities expanded, these systems did not disappear. They continued functioning within new spatial constraints. The concept of mismatch simply acknowledges that inherited traits may respond differently when environmental inputs change abruptly. It does not suggest that humans are incapable of thriving indoors. Rather, it emphasizes proportion. If 80% of human history unfolded outside, then the biological baseline was assembled under those conditions. Modern indoor life is historically exceptional, not evolutionarily foundational. This distinction matters because it reframes assumptions about normality. From the perspective of recent centuries, climate-controlled interiors and artificial lighting may feel standard. From the perspective of 300,000 years, they are recent experiments. Returning again to the origin of Homo sapiens in African landscapes clarifies that baseline. For tens of thousands of years, humans navigated open savannas, coastal plains, forests, and steppes without sealed boundaries. Even after agriculture and urbanization emerged, most labor and social interaction remained outdoors for millennia. Only within the last few generations have large segments of humanity begun spending the majority of time inside enclosed structures. The numerical imbalance remains clear. The mismatch concept encourages careful reflection rather than nostalgia. It invites recognition that bodies and brains evolved under open skies, and that rapid environmental change may create new patterns of strain or adaptation. It does not prescribe a return to prehistoric life. Instead, it situates modern conditions within a much longer narrative. When we ask why 80% of human history was spent outside, the answer lies not only in archaeology or climate, but in this deep evolutionary calibration. The outside world was the consistent frame for survival, memory, and social organization across nearly all generations that have ever lived. Indoor dominance is recent and uneven across the globe. Measured against deep time, the human story remains overwhelmingly an outdoor one. The walls that now surround many of us are thin chapters at the end of a much older account written across landscapes that once defined every aspect of existence. If we place the entire human timeline in view once more, the pattern remains steady and quiet. Roughly 300,000 years have passed since the emergence of Homo sapiens. For nearly all of that span, daily life unfolded in direct contact with open landscapes. Only in the final fraction did agriculture anchor communities more firmly to specific plots of land. Only in the last thin slice did industrial architecture and artificial lighting begin to enclose large populations indoors. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside, we must now draw together the strands we have followed and return to the scale that began this reflection. The earliest generations of our species were shaped in African environments defined by savannas, river valleys, and seasonal climate shifts. Mobility structured survival. Social bonds formed in shared outdoor camps. The body learned to regulate heat under sun and wind. The brain synchronized sleep to sunrise and sunset. Memory mapped terrain rather than corridors. Across more than 11,000 generations before agriculture, these patterns stabilized. Agriculture introduced gradual settlement, but fields and herds still required outdoor labor. Early towns and cities thickened walls yet remained permeable to climate and light. Industrialization and electrification compressed daily life further indoors, but this transition occupies only a handful of generations when measured against the full arc of our species. The numerical proportion does not accuse modern life of being unnatural, nor does it romanticize prehistoric conditions. It simply corrects perspective. What feels permanent in our present is historically brief. The outside world was not a temporary stage before civilization. It was the enduring context within which civilization eventually arose. Walls, glass, and climate systems represent cultural innovations layered atop biological foundations assembled in open air. When we acknowledge this proportion, the narrative of human history shifts subtly. Instead of seeing outdoor life as primitive and indoor life as default, we recognize that enclosure is the recent experiment. The sky was the ceiling for almost every ancestor who has ever lived. Even after villages formed and cities rose, daily survival continued to depend on soil, weather, and light. Only very recently have many humans gained the option to spend most of their time separated from these elements. Returning again to the origin of our species grounds this understanding. For tens of thousands of years before agriculture, exposure to open landscapes was not a choice but a constant. The human organism was calibrated within that constancy. Modern architecture has changed spatial experience rapidly, yet it rests upon systems refined outdoors. The proportion remains clear and steady. The majority of human existence unfolded beneath open sky. As we move toward the close of this exploration, the question remains not whether indoor life is possible, but how a species shaped for open environments carries that long inheritance into enclosed spaces. If we listen carefully to the full arc of our species, what emerges is not a dramatic conflict between past and present, but a long continuity that still runs beneath modern life. For nearly 300,000 years, Homo sapiens existed within environments where light, temperature, wind, and open terrain shaped every decision. Across more than 11,000 generations before agriculture, survival required reading the sky, sensing seasonal change, and moving across land in response to shifting resources. This immense repetition did not disappear when walls were built. It became embedded in biological and cultural systems that remain active today. To understand why 80% of human history was spent outside is to recognize the depth of that embedding. The human body still responds to sunlight with hormonal adjustments that regulate sleep and alertness. Muscles and bones still strengthen when used in sustained movement. The brain still maps space. Even if that space is now an office floor rather than a valley, these responses are not relics. They are living traces of long exposure to open conditions. The fact that modern architecture can buffer weather or artificial lighting can extend day does not erase the evolutionary timeline that shaped these systems. It only layers new possibilities on top of older foundations. When agriculture anchored people to land, and when cities later enclosed neighborhoods, the outside world did not vanish. Fields remained beyond walls. Trade routes crossed deserts and seas. Even industrialization, with its factories and office buildings, relied on resources extracted from open environments. Energy, food, and raw materials continue to originate outdoors. The separation between inside and outside, though spatially reinforced by architecture, remains functionally incomplete. The modern indoor world is sustained by processes that unfold under sky and climate. Placing this recognition within deep time offers perspective rather than prescription. It does not suggest abandoning cities or dismantling technology. It invites a measured awareness that the human organism carries a long outdoor inheritance. When large segments of populations now spend most hours within enclosed spaces, the contrast with ancestral conditions is historically unusual. Yet adaptation remains possible because human culture evolves rapidly. The key insight lies not in reversing history, but in understanding proportion. If 80% of our history unfolded outside, then open environments formed the baseline from which all later innovations arose. The outside world shaped our expectations of rhythm, distance, and change. It framed early cooperation, language development, and social bonding. Even imagination and symbolic thought matured under visible stars and shifting daylight. These influences persist subtly, informing how humans respond to space and time even within enclosed settings. Returning once more to the beginning clarifies the arc. From African savannas to Eurasian plains, from coastal migrations to early farming villages, the majority of human lives were lived without sealed ceilings overhead. Walls became thicker only recently. Climate control became widespread only within a few generations. Against 300,000 years, this is a brief adjustment. The narrative of our species remains overwhelmingly one of outdoor adaptation. As this exploration approaches its quiet close, the question is not whether indoor life is legitimate, but how awareness of deep time might inform present choices. If the sky was once the constant ceiling of humanity, and if open land shaped our bodies and minds for thousands of generations, what does it mean for a modern human to remember that lineage while living among walls? When we allow the full scale of human time to settle in the mind, the conclusion becomes quiet rather than dramatic. For roughly 300,000 years, Homo sapiens has existed on this planet. For the overwhelming majority of that span, daily life unfolded outside. Light arrived directly from the sun. Darkness arrived without interruption from electric glow. Temperature rose and fell according to season and geography. Movement across land was not exercise but necessity. Social life gathered around fires, rivers, trees, and open ground. More than 11,000 generations were shaped in that context before agriculture began to anchor communities to fixed plots. Only a few recent generations have known a world where walls define most waking and sleeping hours. The proportion itself carries the meaning. 80% is not a metaphor. It is a reminder of scale. The outside world was the default setting of human evolution. It formed the baseline for our bodies, our attention, our memory, and our rhythms of rest and activity. The indoor world, by contrast, is historically young. It is a remarkable cultural achievement, offering safety, stability, and comfort unknown to most ancestors. Yet it rests upon systems forged in open environments. To recognize this is not to reject modern life. It is to situate it within a longer story. Throughout this exploration, we have returned again and again to the origin of our species in African landscapes. We have followed migrations across continents, the rise of agriculture, the growth of cities, and the acceleration of industrialization. At each stage, walls grew thicker and interiors more complex. Yet when placed against deep time, these developments occupy a narrow band at the end of the timeline. The human narrative remains overwhelmingly one of open air. There is a steady humility in that realization. The sky that once served as the ceiling for nearly every ancestor still stretches above modern buildings. The soil that sustained early foragers still supports agriculture and urban infrastructure alike. Even now, energy, food, and raw materials originate outdoors. The boundary between inside and outside is practical, but it is not absolute. The longer history of our species continues beneath contemporary routines. As this reflection closes, the question is left gently unresolved. If most of human history unfolded outside, and if our biology was calibrated within that world of shifting light and wind, how might remembering that long inheritance shape the way we understand our present lives among walls?